Well, first, thank you for inviting me. Really, before I say anything else, I want to thank the patients that have really driven all this for many years. You see just some representatives of those patients today, and they're magnificent people. I started on this 20, 30 years ago. My conflict of interest, I have to admit, is that I'm married to a TMJ patient. I'm a basic scientist, a cardiovascular scientist, cardiovascular, renal, genetics, basic science though. Once I began to look at the literature in this field, I was appalled. In many ways, I'm still appalled, but we have come a long way. And I'm going to tell you a little bit how we got there and make some comments on which may not be that politically correct, but which I think need to be said. So where did we start with this? We've had 8 different scientific meetings over a period of 18 years, sponsored by the TMJ Association and NIDCR and other NIH Institute support for these meetings. We've had a really wonderful group of scientists, interdisciplinary scientists that come in. First, they say to me when I invite them, I don't know anything about TMD or J, or whatever this is. What am I going to say? Well, that's precisely what the field needed, and that's why we had these meetings. And I think this is the culmination of it, which I'm pleased to see. So the meetings were driven based on an awareness that there was no coherent body of knowledge on the etiology and the pathogenesis of TMD. The goals were to analyze the state of current research and bring new ideas and perspectives to the field, and I think those meetings have done that. They've resulted in recommendations to the NIH regarding gaps and opportunities of the TMD basic and clinical scientists. And again, I emphasize that these meetings all included patients that really educated all of us enormously, as they're doing at this meeting. So what did we learn? Only 4 bullet points in 19 years. That's all I have time for. But the pathophysiological basis of TMD remains an enigma. That, I think, is clear. We found many hypotheses related to the etiology, but none have been validated. There's a lack of clinical definition. We've heard that discussed at this meeting. It's getting much better, thanks to many of those of you in the room. Is it one or many diseases? We discussed very often. Importantly, I think, the most important thing that came out of these early meetings was that TMD was recognized as more than a problem of jaw dysfunction and pain in the jaw joint. And that really, Larry Tabak put a fine point on that in our TMJ Science that we published these proceedings in, that the TM joint and muscle disorders don't exist alone. They're part of a collection of disorders, and you can read the rest. And this is the collection of these disorders, or at least some of the comorbidities that you've heard talked about at this meeting. And out of this collection of comorbidities, this center concept arose, maybe not a practical concept, but clearly one that we've heard reiterated in many ways and shapes at this meeting, and that is that we need a multidisciplinary integrated patient care and research effort in this area. How we bring that about, I don't know. I drew this as part of one of our meetings, showing this wheel with TMD in the center of the hub and all these sub-disciplines around it, patient-centered database, training programs, scientific cores associated with it, academic centers, medical pharmacy, dental schools involved, affiliated community health and dental clinics, all supporting research by the NIH, R1s, PPGs, K awards, training, trying to get involved with CTSAs and healthcare providers. You've heard all this in one way, shape, or form today, the need for this. So this all led in 2016 again driven by the patients, to this public-private partnership, the TMJ patient-led roundtable, bringing together all the stakeholders, the patients, the scientists, the bioengineers, the oral surgeons, device manufacturers, representatives from the NIH, the FDA, the AHRQ, insurance industry, patient-reported outcome experts, and others. It's been quite amazing seeing all these people around the table, sometimes very conflicted in many ways. But they are coming together, and a lot has happened to that. I've been involved in one of the working groups which related to the basic science needs and the gaps and opportunities in basic science, many of which, again, you have heard in various parts at this meeting today. We had 9 major areas. I'll go over them briefly, but they start with molecular genomics and epigenetics, and I'll take you through the rest down to the animal models, which we just heard about. We clearly need some work in molecular genomics and epigenetics. We need integrated studies of genetic polymorphisms, like the OPERA study has been doing, gene expression, epigenetic markers, nucleosome localization, genome interactions for cell populations, and single cell level studies at the TMD level. We are in this field behind. Other disciplines, my own discipline, cardiovascular physiology and genetics and genomics, is just so far ahead of what's going on in this field. This is not to detract in any way with the work that's going on in OPERA, but these things need to happen in this area. It's just being left in the dust compared to the rest of science. Next, genome sequencing for epigenetic and genetic, proteomic, biomic, immune profiling, on and on. This is lacking at the level it should be. Bioinformatics associated with this, for advanced data analysis. Yes, there's a lot of data out there, but there's not enough people to put it together and analyze it. That's true for a lot of areas. Machine learning, you saw how OPERA is incorporating machine learning very effectively. Novel clustering methods for precise identification of disease risk, looking at therapeutic effectiveness and outcomes of TMJ subjects. Bioinformatic approaches that vertically integrate pathway analysis, and I'll talk more about that momentarily. We identified need for mechanisms, studying mechanisms underlying chronic pain and joint-specific pain in animal models and in humans. Sex differences, which we haven't heard, surprisingly, a lot about today, is an enormous part of this. Epidemiologically, we heard about it. Neuroendocrine system interactions, huge area that needs more work. Immune inflammatory mechanisms, we've just heard about. There's some really neat work. This is a hot area, and it needs more investment in this field. TM joint tissues and mechanics certainly needs greater investment. There's a few really good studies going on in the TM area, but not enough. It's a very unique joint with very unique tissue types, ligaments, muscles, collagens. They're different. Cells, we're learning very quickly in the genomics area, and as we start doing whole genome analysis, we can't look at whole tissues. We have to look at a cell type. Single cell genomics is really driving science now, and that's very much true of these TM joint tissues. Tissue engineering, new model systems, novel materials, regenerative medicine approaches, all needs in this area. And the animal models we just heard about. We clearly need all of that. So that being said, what's not in that list of 9 areas where there are gaps is this big picture. And I put this on this background of a very complex computer model that I was involved with helping Dr. Arthur Guyton develop in the early 70s. This was the beginning of cybernetics. The cardiovascular field was rather much like the TMJ field at that time. Everybody working on a little piece of this, a little piece of that. Nobody really putting it together in a meaningful, quantitative way. That's what that model is behind these 2 statements. And one of the things we learned really soon from this model was that understanding a complex disorder, and I've painted TMD over this, from only one perspective has failed. Can't understand it from candidate genes, the joint, the muscle, the hormones, brain, pain, immune, inflammation. Each alone is insufficient to understand and explain this complex disorder. And in many ways that's intuitive, but it's not really being dealt with experimentally. We're not funding anybody, to my knowledge, outside of what Bill's doing. Bill is right on board with this, but this is where the whole field ought to come together. This kind of integration is needed, both temporally and vertical integration with complex, quantitative, real data. And the bottom says this. Information is needed with genomic sciences together with system-wide phenotyping to provide molecular, cellular, organ determinants of TM function and disease. The other big gap that's really not happening effectively in this field is this coordination between clinical epidemiology, clinical physiology, and animal physiology. We're getting an enormous amount of information from OPERA in terms of the genomics and linkage analysis, GWAS studies. We're getting an enormous amount of information from different animal models. This is my playground here. We're doing mapping and linkage analysis and looking at chondrogenic strains and so on and so forth. But it really has to come together. At the gene level, it can come together, and it is coming together with homology mapping, but ultimately the physiology, the phenotypes, and the disease has to be integrated, and that's not happening in this area. And we're not even getting the information to integrate right now in this field. If we're looking at genomic scale association studies, I haven't seen yet any studies, with the exception of this top one, looking at SNP chips and RNA sequence data, chip sequencing, DNA protein analysis, DNA 3D nucleosome work, high-C chromatin work, transcription factor regulation databases, mouse, rat, model systems. They're not part of the vernacular of this science yet, of this field. And that's desperately needed if we're going to advance. And it's the same in gene editing techniques using these animal models. We cannot understand the association of all these genotypes and sequence variants we're finding out in our GWAS studies and human studies unless we study the mechanisms of how they're affecting the organism. So this whole thing has to be brought together. We have to go from the level of the cell and the genome and the epigenome, the proteome, into some model system. This is another model we built looking at mitochondrial function, but you have to be able to bring the raw data into some sort of predictable quantitative model that shows the emergent properties of all this data you're gathering, and ultimately bring in your clinical data with it. This has to converge. It's not converging yet in any field, but this should be our goal. So some facts, and these we can talk about these because these are the numbers that I've sort of dug up on my own. The NIDCR funding of TMD research versus overall funding from that institute, which runs about 400 million since 2003 up to 2018. TMJ research in 2017 was about 3 to 4% of the total NIDCR budget, or $11.2 million in 2017 versus their total budget of $371 million. That's the little orange line down here. It wavers up and down a little bit over the years, but this is not going to get it. Dr. Summerman sent me these data last night, actually. We had asked about how much of their budget actually goes into dental school research versus medical school research. Of that 3 or 4%, as I'm understanding it, 48% of it goes to dental schools, 5.3 million, annually. Medical schools, 2.6 million, 23%, and other, I don't know what other is, but you can see that there is money going out trying to, I think appropriately, develop the kind of interdisciplinary expertise needed to do some of these complex studies. But it's just not enough. NIDCR funded 36 TMD-related research grants in their FY18 budget. They're listed right there. As best I could break them down from titles and abstracts, 11 of these were pain, neurobasis of pain. 2 were pain related to sex differences. 3rd, really pain, emotion, dysregulation, sleep, bruxism, structure function, ligaments, so on. And 4, TM disc regeneration, 7, genetics, 2, immune factors, 1, risk factors, 1, therapy, drug delivery, 2, and 1 K99 training grant. That's just not enough. This field is not going to advance with this kind of effort. If you look at an area that I'm particularly interested in, that's molecular genomics. If you go to PubMed and simply type in genomics or proteomics and so on, and cardiovascular, you get 14,500 hits. The kidney, which I'm also involved in, you get 8,400 hits. Pain, not too good. You get 2,000 hits. TMD or TMJ, you get 108. That tells me a lot. I think there's also this issue of disconnect between dental and medical school basic and translational research. That's no secret. Generally, there remains paltry basic research collaborations with dental and medical schools. NIDCR funding for TMD-related basic research is very limited, even in the top 5 research ranked dental schools. Aggressive efforts to stimulate an integrated approach to study TMD is lacking. The science and the funding silos represent a great impediment in this field, and that's huge. It's silos between medical schools and dental schools. It's silos between the institutes of the NIH, on and on. It's just for a complex disorder like TMD that you've heard about all day, things have to work better between the parts of this, both the individuals and the institutes and centers involved. So I guess I'm down to number 4, which is a little repetitive. There's a little evidence of efforts to comprehensively integrate cell tissue specific functions with those of the whole organism. If you look at what's going on in terms of medical school versus dental school funding, I have a number of 147 medical schools versus 51 dental schools. So there's 3 times more medical schools than dental schools only, but they have 70 times more funded research. This is the 2019 February $14 billion for medical schools, $202 million for dental schools. So there's far fewer dental school faculty with NIH-funded research, clearly. On top of that, TMD is not a priority of dental school research. Thirdly, NIH-wide funding for TMD-related basic research is difficult to obtain since reporting is not broken down in that manner. So it's really hard to get the actual numbers of grants. In many ways, you could say everything done across every institute relates to TMJ and pain or something, because it's all tissue. It's all, if you get down to the level of cell biology, it of course pertains to a lot of things. So it is hard to break out. I understand that. But even with that, you put the cumulative information together, and you see TMD is a disorder in trouble in terms of research funding. So It's necessary to extend TMD basic and translational research beyond the narrow province of dentistry to include the basic scientific and clinical disciplines needed to study this complex disorder. Basic research in dental schools would greatly benefit from collaborations with medical school faculty, schools of bioengineering, pharmacy schools, and related shared core resources. Advances in the basic sciences related to TMD need to be coordinated, I think, with the Trans-Institute Agency Research Planning Group to set the goals based on exciting scientific and clinical missions that are going to attract both basic, translational, and clinical and engineers. And not just for pain. That's, I think, a problem. Patients' expertise should be sought to identify and help focus broad research areas of greatest relevance to them. That's really what drove all these meetings we've had. The patients have really educated us. Every aspect of basic and clinical TMD research needs a significant increase of funding to attract the scientists from those disciplines that are essential to develop teams of experts to address the obvious gaps in this field. And I finish simply with what I think is one of the biggest gaps, and that is a lack of integration of knowledge from cell to organism that would pertain to the TMD field. Thank you.
Thank you very much.